Hey, everybody. I hope you are having a wonderful evening. Very excited to talk to you today about the glue that holds everything together, the backbone of everything that is real estate rentals. And that is the tenancy process, because this is where you're really going to make or break your entire investment strategy. I can't tell you how many people call me excited that they've bought a property in some market. And they call me because something is not going the way it's supposed to during the tenancy process. And so, one of the first things we're going to talk about is how we pull everything together from starting at marketing all the way to the lease and what terms we want to put in there, and then how we handle move outs. But what I want you thinking about as we're talking about this today is this all begins with scoping and research for the market and the team that you are working with. Very, very important, because you can have the absolute coolest property with great looking returns, but if it's in the wrong market or you're with the wrong team, you're going to have problems. And so very, very important to keep that in mind. We use a lot of QR codes, so I want you to go ahead and get your camera out. As you guys know, we're going to have upcoming events we're going to want you to take links for. But of course, you are more than welcome to email us after the webinar today, and we can send you over links for our upcoming events. So this is going to be the last class in our 4-part series, and this one is going to be over the doubling process. This one's going to have a lot of technical information and walk you through how you start with a property and how you move into building a portfolio. And so this is going to be a very important webinar. As always, if you can't watch it live, we'll have a rewatch link that we can send out to you. But of course, we always recommend watching it live so that you can interact as well. We have our upcoming Wealth and Rentals Conference weekend. This is going to be fun. On December 8th, we have our property bus tour from 10 to 5, and then we'll have our conference in the evening with like a cocktail hour. And then Saturday the 9th is our big party event. So if you want to get invited to that, please shoot me a note and we can get you over an invite. That will be hosted at Michael's in my home, and we look forward to seeing everybody. It's been way too long. We have 3 in-person bus tours coming up. We have one on the 28th, one on the 18th, and one on December 8th. And if you didn't watch our virtual bus tour that we just did, it was fantastic. We've had great feedback on how it really gives you a different type of look at these areas. And we'll have our second virtual tour coming up covering more of our markets in the next couple of weeks. Again, Wealth and Rentals, everything that we do here is about educating you and bringing information to you so that you can make the best decision for your financial future. That includes our live events, our personal mentorships, our masterminds, and our consulting that we do, well, that I do on a daily basis. If you haven't been watching our podcast, would love for you to join that. We have lots of information we're providing constantly, little tidbits here and there. And then, of course, all of our education goes on our YouTube channel. And so that's where you'll be able to find webinars like this after they have aired live. To join our texting list, you can text JOIN to this number here, and that will keep you up to date on upcoming events and specials for live events, tours, and other opportunities. And then finally, if you're not already on our email list, this is where we're going to send you all of the exclusive access to webinars, events, all of the things that we do, and also keep you up to date when we have new things that are added. We have a lot of things that we'll add where we're not marketing them for months. And so if you're not on the mailing list, you're probably not going to see it. And then again, I want to remind everybody, if you have any questions after any of these webinars, or you want me to take a look at your portfolio, your financial situation, what you're doing, and guide you, I do consults every day. Consults last anywhere from about 20 to 40 minutes, and I think they charge $125. It's a great value because it really kind of gives you a jump start of looking at, okay, here's where I am, here's where I want to be, this is what I'm trying to accomplish, and lets me guide you and come up with a plan for you. And then, of course, beyond that, you can either follow that plan or we can talk about mentorship opportunities. But consult's a great place to get started, and we have a lot of information we're going to ask you to send before that consult that I will review before we hop on a phone call or a Zoom. Before I begin, as always, everything I'm going to talk about today is based on my best years of experience and judgment, based on doing this for almost 18 years, not only as an owner-operator of a real estate investment and property management firm, but also an investor myself. It's very important that you have a lot of people in your corner helping you build your investment journey and the model that you're going to use to create that wealth for yourself. And we are just one tool in that toolbox. Of course, we believe that our model and the way that we do things in the market in which we do them are the best that you're going to find. However, Our model is not a fit for everybody, and any real estate investment can be subject to loss or risk. And so very important that you do your due diligence, you do your research. And if we can't answer a question for you or it's outside our realm of experience, we are going to refer you to people who do a good job, in our opinion, to be able to help you answer those questions and guide you on your way. So quick little recap here. I want to remind everybody our model has 3 steps. Well, there's a lot of steps, but they kind of boil down to 3 basic steps. One is that you buy property with max leveraging. So that means that you're financing the property to purchase it. You're going to 1031 exchange or sell the property or cash out during years 2 to 6, depending on equity capture, depending on appreciation and principal pay down. And then step 3 is you're going to double. You're going to go buy 2 properties for 1, or depending on what the market's done, maybe 2.5 for 1 or 3 for 1, just depends on where appreciation and those numbers have been. So what we are talking about today is the space between step 1 and step 2. And of course, step 3 is really a repeat of step 1. And so we're constantly in this pattern of doubling and doubling. And so it's very, very important that we preserve and we protect the property in that period between step 1 and step 2, so that it's ready for you when it's time to do that. So again, we're going to buy a property or properties with max leveraging. That special step in between is we're going to receive our monthly cash flow and tax benefits. And then the property is going to appreciate, principal is going to pay down. And then finally, we're going to refinance or cash out, do a 1031 exchange, and go right back to step 1. And so this is that life cycle that we've been talking about and that we teach you to be able to do for yourself. So the first step with any rental property, once you've closed on it or you've acquired it, is to start marketing and leasing it. Now, if you have a tenant in place, that process is going to start a little bit in the middle, but it's really not going to change your first step, which is figuring out what that property should rent for. And from there, of course, that is where you're going to begin the marketing process. Either if that lease is up and it's under rented and you give them notice of an increase, they may give notice, they may agree to the increase. If they don't agree to the increase, then that's going to start your marketing and leasing process at that step. But don't think because you're buying a property, if it has a tenant in it, that you should just be sitting back and letting it cash flow. You still need to be running your numbers, just like we run numbers on our value and our equity, and constantly confirming our cash on cash return, looking at what we can do with that equity and that cash that we have in that deal. Very important that you're looking at your rent numbers too, because that's paramount to your return and your success. Online is, of course, the gold standard. Back when I started in the industry, most people weren't using the internet, and certainly not for real estate. And it really has completely transformed in the last almost 20 years. Most people, the vast majority of people, are finding their home online. And so very important that you are reaching all of those people online. And we're going to talk about that more when we talk about from the perspective of how does IDX work, how does the MLS work? Because very, very important when you're renting the property that, it used to be the old adage, oh, I'm just going to put a sign in the yard that's going to rent the property. And that's really not the case. Lots of people, especially in North Texas, they're relocating here. And so they're never seeing the property before they move in. And they're barely even getting to know the area in a lot of cases. And so you want to make sure that you're reaching those people who are not here local. So where should you be marketing that property? Online marketing, again, has to be the core of any marketing plan. If it's not in a high-risk area, meaning vandalism risk, I always recommend a sign in the yard. If we're dealing in properties in South Dallas, South Fort Worth, South Houston, there are certain areas where we don't recommend a sign in the yard on a vacant property. Very important that if you are buying a property that is tenant occupied, check that lease and see if you are allowed to market it during the end of the lease once you or they have given notice. Because one of the ways that we minimize vacancy is marketing while the tenant is still there. And our leases allow us to do that. We'll talk about that a little bit later in this webinar. But very, very important that you don't wait until it's vacant to market. It doesn't have to be in perfect condition. You have to remember that everything that you're going to do when you own your property and you're managing your property or you're working with a third-party manager is to keep that property in the condition where you can market it during the tenancy. So very important, very, very important. We want to make sure that we look at the price on an ongoing basis when we list a property that's vacant. Sometimes lowering the price a little bit for the first rental to get someone in faster is a great trick. We tell people to prepare for up to 60 days vacant. That's why we do a 2-month re-renting period. Again, we're going to talk about that in a few minutes. But keep in mind that even a $25 reduction on a $1,200 rental is only the same difference as 1 week vacant. So $25 reduction is a $300 a year loss. That's less than a week vacant. And so very, very important to keep in mind that small little price reduction might be the difference between finding a tenant tomorrow and it taking another month. Similarly, a $50 price reduction is only the same thing as 2 extra weeks vacant. And so if you're sitting on a property, you might think, well, I want to get absolute top dollar. If the range is 13 to 1500, I'm going in at 15. It might be beneficial to go at 1475, especially if there's comps at 1500 on the market, because you're going to stand out, you're going to tenant quicker, and in reality, it's actually going to make you more money. And then once you've got a tenant in place where you've got that 2-month period to market, then we can play more to get to top of the market. Don't get stuck on your price on the first vacant listing. A small price reduction really truly does go a long way, and most of the time you're going to wind up ahead. A lot of people ask me, well, why do you not include a fridge with your rentals? I don't see a washer and dryer. Don't tenants not have those things? And actually, that's not the case, especially in North Texas. It is pretty much normal. And I can't really say there is a normal, but there is, right? We have tons of properties. This is what we do. Tenants provide their own fridge. They like to have what they have. Some people like French door fridges. Some people, they want water and ice in the door. So really, I do not recommend including a fridge. I do not provide a fridge on any of my properties. And I don't provide a washer and dryer. The only time I will put a washer and dryer in a unit is if it's a stackable closet that will not hold a standard size set. A lot of people don't realize that most of your high efficiency machines can be stacked, and people just buy like a $30 or $40 stacking kit. So again, we do not want to provide these appliances, not only because it's not customary and they're going to ask you to get rid of them because they're going to have their nice fancy ones that they want to keep, but also they are the #1 appliances to break, and they are the most expensive to repair and the most likely to cause damage. If it's your fridge that causes damage, you are responsible. If it's the tenant's fridge that causes damage, the tenant is responsible. So again, we want to only include a stove, the dishwasher, and the microwave. Should you use an agent to list the property? So this kind of goes back to marketing, because at the end of the day, you really truly want access to the MLS to get access to realtor.com and the IDX. So for example, the way that we operate as a management company is we do full MLS marketing, just like if you were selling a home. And that gets you access to what's called the IDX, or the Internet Data Exchange. And that is what transmits the property to the thousands of sites that download information from the MLS, including realtor.com. Now, it's possible there's going to be some law changes where MLS may not just be available to realtors, but to all agents. But at the end of the day, right now, you have to be a member of the Realtor Association to even have access to the MLS. So it's not just using an agent, it's using an agent who is also a member of the Board of Realtors. And there's a local board, a state board, and a national board. The benefit of working with an agent if you're a tenant is that it's not really going to cost you anything. Just like when you buy a home, there's a commission that's being paid out of the listing agent's commission. It's the same way for the tenancy. So when we list a property, we are listing a commission, and that's being paid to the tenant's agent. And so we are incentivizing these agents to bring tenants. And a lot of tenants will want to work with an agent because they're not meeting strangers at a home. They're working with someone who's a licensed professional. And one of the benefits for an owner for working with agents is that those agents are going to pre-screen those tenants. And so most of the time, like my people, we have a set checklist that we run through. And so if we know someone's not going to meet the qualifications for a property, we're going to tell them that up front. And that's not going to be someone that we're going to waste time going to go show. An example of that would be like a sex offender. If someone contacts us and says that they're a registered sex offender, well, that's an automatic disqualifier. We're not going to go pre-screen and move past that stage because they're not going to qualify for our properties. A lot of times, some of the agents will even run the application in advance, but certainly if you hire a property manager, they should be running that application for you. And that's really important because oftentimes what we are going to have access to, especially those of us that do high volume and have the ability to pay for those really advanced background checks, we're looking at bankruptcy history. We're looking at bankruptcy filings. We're looking at criminal history going back decades. We're looking at eviction losses where they've lost in court. We're looking at eviction filings where they were filed on, but they paid. And so a lot of times when someone looks at an eviction history search, they're only looking at the court record of cases that they've lost. And that's going to miss out because a lot of people pay late. And that means that they're having evictions filed on them, but they're paying and making it good. And so they never actually get evicted. You want to see that too, because, although we do everything we can to vet a rental verification, to verify it, if someone is leasing from an individual landlord, that can be very difficult to guarantee that's a valid rental history. And so this is just an extra step above and beyond. Very, very important. Of course, you're going to get professional help with the lease. You'll get professional help with the marketing, pricing, and tenant screening. So, something to keep in mind, and we're going to talk in a little bit about whether or not you need a property manager, but you don't have to have a property manager to hire an agent to list the property. Like, we call them lease listing onlys, and what we will do is list the property for lease, and then someone after that is leased will go self-manage. And so don't think that you have to have a property manager to be able to get a property listed and marketed on the MLS. The cost is usually between 75% and 100% of the first month's rent, and that includes the reciprocal payment out to the cooperating broker or the cooperating agent who brings the tenant. So let's talk about bringing the tenant. Let's talk about how we select and how we screen our tenants. The general criteria that I recommend is that they make 2.5 to 3 times the rent as income. The cheaper the property, the more that they should make. So an $800 rental, we want to see that 3 times number. A $3,000 rental, we're happier with that 2.5 times. We want no recent evictions. This is really important. I personally do second chance leasing for people that have had, if you're on my Facebook, you probably already know this, but I do a lot of second chance leasing for people that have had evictions or had blemishes on their credit, had health issues where they couldn't pay their bills, death of a spouse, all sorts of things, people with drug charges where they were in prison. I do that for my personal portfolio as a mission. It's very personal to me. But from a perspective of renting out in the lowest risk type of model, that is not something that I recommend you as an investor should be doing. I have the blessing and the benefit of being able to do that, but it is definitely higher risk. And so we can't say no criminal history. That's really important because there's a lot of things, and disparate impact, if you're not familiar with that. Essentially what that says is that you're really discriminating if you say no criminals. And there's a lot of reasons behind it. I'm not going to go into that today. I've actually taught other webinars on that. But basically, the bottom line is if their criminal charge does not affect your property or their ability to pay for your property, then it should not be considered and they're renting your property. So, like, for example, if someone has a DWI, that really doesn't affect your property. If someone has a drug manufacturing charge where they were creating methamphetamine, that absolutely affects your property. Sex offense, that affects your property. So you need to not say no criminal record. You need to have specific things that are disqualifiers. Specifically property related, some financial crimes. Again, it just depends on what the crime is and how old it is. You want to make sure, again, that you're checking eviction filings, not just lost cases or judgments. You need to know if they've been filed on, not just if they've lost. Because keep in mind, if I file an eviction on a tenant and that tenant takes off before court, that's not going to show as a one eviction. So very, very important. And then finally, you want to do a thorough background history search. That means that you want to be looking at their credit score. You want to be looking at their criminal record. You want to be looking at the things that are on their credit, their history. And you want to make sure you're using a good provider. If you're not working with an agent or a property manager, there are lots of companies that can help you. Some are better than others. They're expensive, but at the end of the day, it is worth it to pre-screen that tenant more thoroughly because that tenant is going to be someone you're basically married to for the next year or two, however long it is. Now, one thing I am going to mention, a lot of people tell me, well, I want to do a 2-year lease. I want to do a multi-year lease. And I'll go ahead and tackle that right now. It's very important that you don't start with a long lease on a new tenant. You don't know who it is. You don't know anything about them. You don't know their personality, and you only know what you've been able to locate on paper. If you have a great tenant that looks great on paper, give them a year, maybe even a year and a couple of months, because again, we're going to tier those leases to prime season. However, some of the best qualified tenants can be your most demanding and difficult tenants. And so again, I reiterate, do not do a multi-year lease on a brand new tenant. And keep in mind, if you locked into that low rent for many years and rents are going up, you are missing out on a lot of extra income. You want to make sure that you create a tenant selection criteria and have that available and accessible. If you have a website you're operating, it should be on there. If you're working with the property manager, you want to make sure your property manager has it on there. And that tenant selection criteria protects them and it protects you, that you are not discriminating, that you have a set criteria and that is the criteria you follow. Because what you never want is for someone to claim that you are discriminating against them and that's why you have rejected them. And the way that you protect yourself, of course, is to have a standard protocol that you follow and you treat everyone the same. So when owners ask me, well, I want to meet my tenant, I want to interview my tenant, those are all major red flags because that's just ripe and asking for a problem. You need to look at someone on paper. It does not matter what they look like. It does not matter how they sound. None of that matters. What matters is, are they going to pay their rent and do they have a history of showing that they're going to be a good tenant? That is what matters. So that's a perfect segue into fair housing because this is one of the biggest things when people are self-managing, I see them make mistakes on. So some of the things that we hear owners say, even when they hire us, I only want to rent to a family. I don't want to rent to a single man. They have too many kids and they'll trash the place. They're too young to be responsible. Statements like these are the types of statements that are going to get you sued. Statements like these are the types of ways that you're going to violate the law and not even realize that you're doing it. So the Fair Housing Act, which is actually Title 8 of the Civil Rights Act that was enacted in 1968, prohibits discrimination in housing. So that qualifies on buying property, selling property, renting property, or financing property. And the protected classes are race, color, national origin, religion, sex, and as of 1988, they added familial status and disability. Some states or local areas actually have laws above and beyond the Fair Housing Act, but no states or areas can reduce the Fair Housing Act. This is the minimum standard. Handicap accessibility is a big one. Very important to know, disabled individuals are protected in all areas of public life and private life, including jobs, schools, transportation, and anywhere open to the public. The protected disabilities that you might see are mobility impairments. Maybe they need a cane or a walker or a wheelchair. Hearing impairments, maybe they are deaf or partially deaf and they need special smoke detectors that flash at them. Visual impairments, perhaps they need talking smoke detectors. Chronic alcoholism, if they're currently in treatment, then that's a protected disability. Mental illness, of course. HIV, AIDS, and AIDS-related items, and mental retardation. These are all protected disabilities. Now, that doesn't mean that you have to pay for those items. So we're going to talk about how those items work in a moment. Now, one of the things to keep in mind is that not all disabilities are observable. So just because you can't see that someone is disabled does not mean it doesn't qualify and does not mean that they are not. So we come to reasonable accommodations. And so basically this is just an adjustment or an exception to one of your rules or policies. And so this may be something that they need because they're disabled, and that is the only way that they're going to be able to have an equal opportunity to use and enjoy a property. And that includes public and common spaces too. So I'll give you an example of this. I have a tenant that's moving into one of my properties who has a wheelchair and needs a wheelchair ramp. And so under the law, I am not required to provide this accommodation. I am required to allow them to provide the accommodation for themselves. So I don't have to build the wheelchair ramp. The tenant has to build it or can pay us to build it or pay someone to build it. But then they have to return the property to its original condition when they leave. In this particular case, I decided to provide it for the tenant. Again, I have the benefit of being able to do that. And I felt like that was something that would be better for me to provide. But I was not legally obligated to do that. It takes a couple hours to build a wood ramp, no big deal. One of the ones that we run into more frequently is widening doorways. And yes, if the tenant needs the doorway widened, you have to allow them to do that, grab bars in the shower. But again, they have to return that property back to its original condition before they vacate. Some reasonable accommodations are basically required unless it's a burden to you. So one of the thresholds, anytime we're looking at accommodations and disabilities and all of this type of stuff, is it a financial burden for you? And this is a big one because sometimes it can be. So an accommodation might be a change in the rules of a property. It could be a change in policies at the property. Again, wheelchair ramps, upfront reserved parking, specifically in multifamily, we run into this a lot. Now, multifamily is a little bit different. If it's in a common area or it's in areas that are like parking lots and walk spaces, that can be something that you have to provide or accommodate at your own expense. And so, like, for example, I have a property, one of my 10-unit apartment complexes that has a disabled tenant, and she needed an upfront handicap parking space. And so we put a handicap sign up, and that space is now handicapped and it's available and accessible for her. That's not something that I would charge her for. It's on the common property. It's not in her specific unit. But if it's inside the unit, it's a modification. That is something where the tenant becomes responsible and it has to be returned to its original condition. Now, one of the big ones of these are service animals. And so this is what we're going to talk about in just a moment. That's going to be its whole own section. Now, a reasonable modification is something where we are making a reasonable modification as long as it doesn't, again, cause that undue financial burden. So tenants have to get approval from the landlord for modifications. And as I mentioned, they have to be done and then put back to the way that they were when they move out. The tenant cannot do it themselves. This has to be done by a third party. The tenant can't come in there and build their own ramp. They have to hire someone. I prefer and I recommend that you have them pay you to pay someone so you can pick who's doing work on your home. But again, the most common ones that we see, doorway widening, grab bars, and installing a ramp inside the property. And those would be tenant expense because they are inside, not outside. Landlords will typically require that unit to be restored to the original condition, but you could decide not to, depending on whether it adds to the property or removes to the property. I can remember one where it was a tub with a shower curtain and the tenant needed a sliding door with a grab bar. And obviously there was no reason to remove that sliding door. It looked great. And so it just depends on what the item is. Now, the only exception to this is if it's federally assisted housing, then at that point you're going to become responsible as the owner. I don't recommend doing federally assisted housing. You know, that's like if you have a whole complex that's doing assisted housing, but that's not real common. Usually it's one unit or, you know, multiple units. Now, let's talk about service animals, because there's a lot of misconceptions about service animals and a lot of people do this wrong, and it's a major liability. So a service animal is any dog or miniature horse, yes, miniature horse, that is trained to perform tasks or do work for the benefit of a disabled individual related to their disability. So disabilities can be physical, sensory, psychiatric, intellectual, or any other type of mental disability. There are very specific questions that you should ask and are allowed to ask to determine whether or not a property qualifies as a service animal. You have to make sure you do not go above and beyond these questions. Very high liability. And I want to remind you that just because it does not qualify as a service animal with some of these questions does not mean that the tenant is not going to be able to bring it in deposit free. So let's start with those questions. Number one, is the animal a dog or a miniature horse? And is it readily apparent that this animal is trained to do work or perform tasks for the benefit of an individual with a disability? Examples of that would be guiding an individual who's blind or has low vision, pulling a wheelchair, providing assistance with stability or balance to an individual with an observable mobility disability. One of the ones we see a lot are dogs that are there for people who have seizures. So there's kind of like the four most common ones, and those are the ones that we see the most common. If the answer is yes to those questions, that pet absolutely qualifies as a service animal and it is no longer considered a pet. Now, again, we want to recommend that when you're talking to the tenant, these are the only two questions you ask. So the first questions are the ones that you're asking yourself. The second questions are what you can ask the tenant. Number one is the animal required because of a disability? And number two, what work or task has the animal been trained to perform? Do not ask the tenant about the nature or extent of their disability, and never ask for documentation. Never, ever ask for documentation. Remember, even if it doesn't qualify as a service animal, it very well would qualify as a support animal or assistance animal or emotional support animal. All of the types of animals that we run into that are not considered pets, emotional support, comfort, well-being, and companionship animals, do not do a specific work or task for purposes of analysis under the ADA, but they can qualify as an emotional support animal, which has the same protections for deposit-free and breed restrictionless ability. So what if it's not a dog? Now, these three pictures here you might be laughing at, but all three of these have been used as emotional support animals. In fact, I even had a case where they had emotional support goats in the backyard, and they reported me to housing. They reported me to the government agency because we did not allow them to have their, I think it was 3 goats. So at the end of the day, you have to make judgment calls about what makes sense and how you are going to be protected. The purpose of emotional support animals are very different than the purpose of a service animal. In reality, the emotional support animal serves no purpose except to the mental state generally of the person who has them. And it doesn't have to be a dog. There's no law that specifically says it has to be a dog. There is documented writing that says it has to be a dog or a cat, can't be a barnyard animal. But again, I have seen cases where any type of animal can be upheld, and where even if you are in the right and the documentation says no barnyard animals, it becomes a problem. So you as a landlord have to make the decision of what risk you are prepared for and what risk you are comfortable with. Obviously, in a state like Texas, it's going to be a bit more lax than in a state, say, like California. But again, this is one of the reasons why I do recommend you have a property manager, because these are the laws and things that they're going to be navigating on a daily basis. Reasonable accommodations can translate into these examples of animals to be allowed in the property as well. It's not just modifying a home for someone in a wheelchair, it's also modifying for the other protected disabilities like mental state. So if the animal is individually trained to do work or perform tasks that can't be performed by a dog, even if service animals technically only say dog or miniature horse, that can still be allowed. Sometimes they'll provide something that says that the allergies prevent the person from using a dog, or without that animal, the effects or the symptoms of their disability would be increased. So again, there's lots of gray area in these laws. It is about making step-by-step decisions, case by case, and documenting what you do and how you got to that decision. So if someone complains, which they will, they do, it happens, that you are protected and you can fight that claim. And I have been there, and you just want to make sure that you have your documentation and you are following the law. So one of the things that people will tell me when they call is, well, my tenant wants to have an emotional support chicken, but they're going to keep it outside so it doesn't count. Doesn't work that way. It just doesn't work that way. Now, where some of the thresholds can change is if those pets are doing damage, if those animals are doing damage. So let's reiterate the difference between support animals and emotional support animals. So a service animal performs a task or does work. It is a tool. An emotional support animal is also a tool, but it is used without a specific work or task. Most commonly, what we see emotional support animals for are anxiety or PTSD. In all cases, the type of pet, the type of dog, the breed of dog, whether it's neutered or not, does not matter. We see, and it is absolutely abused, tenants that have aggressive breed dogs will use these policies to get that pet in your home. If you have an insurance policy that restricts breeds, you need to change that insurance policy. There is this misnomer that insurance policies restrict breeds, and that's normal. It is not. There are plenty of policies that do not. And whether or not you're going to have to allow an aggressive breed dog in your home, it doesn't matter, because you could have a stray dog wander on your property that happens to be an aggressive breed and it bites somebody. You must make sure that you are properly insured for pets. I can tell you, in all my career, I have maybe heard of 2 dog bites, and it wasn't to people, it was to other pets, like pets fighting at a fence. I can think of one time where someone had a Chihuahua that bit. So you hear the horror stories, I know they happen, but we've been doing this a very long time and it is not common. But you don't want to be the one that has it happen and you're not properly insured. Now keep in mind, again, a service animal and an emotional support animal, they are not a pet. The moment they meet that criteria, they are now a tool. They are not a pet. There is no pet deposit. There is no pet fee. There is no pet addendum. It is not a pet. It doesn't matter if you have a pet-free building or a pet-free property. Just because you decide to say it's a pet-free property does not mean that you do not have to accommodate these animals. The tenant is still completely responsible for damages, and this is really important. Going back to my goat case, this was part of the problem, was the goats were chewing the AC lines and chewing the AC insulation and causing damage. And so again, the tenant is still responsible for the damages these pets cause. And that doesn't mean you have to wait for them to move out to make them take care of the damage. And again, this is going to go back to why we do our visits, which we're going to get there in a moment. So the Fair Credit Reporting Act is what talks about how you handle, when you are running tenants, what you do with the reports that you get. So a report that is run can be a credit report, a rental verification, a reference check, or a criminal history. So if one of you has a property manager and that property manager runs a credit report and you say, I want to see the credit report, and your property manager has told you, no, I'm so sorry, I can't give you that. That is actually what falls under the Fair Credit Reporting Act, because you are not a credit reporting agency or a pulling agency, and we cannot transmit those reports. We cannot even provide a tenant a copy of their own report. So very important that when you run these reports, you are not giving them or showing them to anyone. That is for your use only. Before you get any report, you have to certify that that report is only being used for the rental property. If any adverse action is given, you must give notice to the applicant. So if you have a tenant and maybe their credit score is 580, but everything else looks great, and you're going to offer them a double deposit, that is actually considered rejecting them. That's considered an adverse action. And so that has to be sent to them in writing. Very, very important step that people miss. In addition to that, there's timelines for processing applications. That application has to be processed and you have to make a determination within a week, or it's automatically considered approved. So any adverse action, again, is denial, requiring a higher deposit, requiring a cosigner, or requesting increased rent more than another applicant. So if you offer something other than what you are marketing the property as, that is an adverse action and you have to send that letter. Now, you should keep a copy of the letter that you send, and that letter has certain things it has to include. It should have the contact information for whoever the report was supplied by, including the name, the address, the phone number, and the credit score, a statement of who you got the report from and that they did not make the decision on the application and cannot give specific reasons as to the adverse action. It should give them an explanation of their right to dispute the accuracy or completeness of that report. And then, of course, the explanation of where they can get a copy of the free report of the company who processed it. And they have 60 days to request that report. When you're done with the report, you have to dispose of it. I recommend shredding it. If it's an online file, you need to delete it and empty your trash. That way, the report can never be later read or reconstructed. Now, let's move on to the lease, because obviously the terms of this lease are going to be what dictate this tenancy and making it successful. So the important lease terms that I recommend you include, and of course, this is for Texas. Some states will allow you to do these things. Some things will not be allowed in other states. So Texas law has a 3-day eviction notice period. Our TAR lease overrides that to a 1-day eviction notice, which means that after 24 hours of receipt of that notice, we can file eviction. We want to make sure that recurring visits are allowed. That's not only to maintain condition, but it's also to be able to do unannounced visits. We want to be able to show up with no notice and be able to access the property. Tenants are to maintain all expenses like lawn care, pest control, utilities. The only time this is going to be different is in the multifamily application, and even then, we're going to hold them responsible or bill back as much as we can. And then, of course, the showings at the end of the lease, that 60-day re-renting period is very important. Now, keep in mind that online templates are not always based on local law. They're not always landlord friendly, and they're not always property code compliant. So don't just go online and go download some template that you're going to use. You want to make sure that you are using a proper form for your market that's going to meet the criteria that you need to be in the best position possible. Now, the deposit should always be a minimum of 1 month's rent. So if your rent is $1,300, your deposit should be a minimum of $1,300. Your move-in funds should always be certified. That means cashier's check or money order, never accept cash, much too risky. So move-in funds are going to be your non-refundable pet fee, your pet deposit, if there's a pet, and a security deposit equal to or exceeding the first month's rent and the first month's rent. So the tenant is going to have a lot of things that they're paying for move-in that are certified, because you don't want to let a tenant move in on money that can bounce. You want to make sure at move-in you are collecting the full first month, even if they're moving in the middle of a month. That secures more money up front. And then the second month is when you're going to collect the prorated for the actual first month's period of time. If the tenant is late on a payment or the payment bounces, you want to make sure you collect certified funds. Now, if they're a day or two late, not a big deal. But if they're paying a week late, make sure you get certified funds. I do recommend looking into or using a program like Pay Near Me or a similar payment option, where a tenant can go to places anywhere around the US, bring cash, and pay their rent. So like we use Pay Near Me, it works at CVS and Walgreens and Walmart and all sorts of places. And that limits the excuses. The most common one we hear is, oh, I had a funeral, I had to leave town. Well, now you can go, even if you're out of town, and pay your rent. You have to remember that tenants will make up excuses. It's common. It's not that you're being heartless, but you're running a business, and you have to make sure you are always treating this as a business. Now let's talk about the importance of walkthroughs, because of everything that happens during a tenancy, this is probably the most important. A walkthrough is a visit where we photograph and assess the condition inside and outside of the property. We're going to be looking for violations and any issues with property condition, not only items that the tenant have caused, but also items that could be the property having issues that we want to address before they get out of control and become more expensive. So the entire goal, we have 4. We want to make sure that we're identifying these items as early as possible before they become more costly. An example of that would be foundation movement, water leaks, gas leaks. We want to make sure that we're having the tenants fix the issues or violations up front during the lease so that we're in better condition to show when it's time to re-rent or sell. And then, of course, we want to be able to prove condition for our deposit itemizations that are done at move out. We'll talk about that in a moment. The common things that we find at our walkthroughs are tenants not watering their yards, drywall cracks inside, some are normal, movement, some are not, leaks outside, dirty air filters, which can cause very expensive, costly AC repairs, not maintaining their flower beds, not trimming their trees, out drug paraphernalia on counters, unauthorized pets, unauthorized occupants, above ground pools, above ground trampolines, all that are major insurance issues. This is an example of a walkthrough on one of my properties that was completed October 11th. So this is a brand new walkthrough, and you'll notice each room is extremely thorough. So everything looked great in this house. The only thing that my team noted that was really an issue from these pictures here is that top left photo. You'll start to see a little bit of a hairline crack coming on 2 of my drywall seams that come together. And otherwise the house looked great. And you'll notice they're taking photos of the floors, the ceilings, the walls, every little thing that could potentially be an issue, so that at move out, if we have to bill a tenant for something, we have proof that it was not like that, not only when they moved in, but also during the tenancy. Now let's talk about this re-renting period, because one of the reasons we do all these things is so that we can market that property while the tenant still lives there. So the re-renting period is the end of the lease once notice has been given, where we put in our leases that we are allowed to put on a lockbox and show the property. Now, most companies we see do 30 days, and we just don't find that to be enough. And that's because generally a high quality tenant has to give their current landlord notice, and most landlords are going to require 30 or 60 days notice. So if they're looking at your property 15 days into that 30-day notice, odds are they're going to still have to give notice, and you're signing up for a period of vacancy that's extended, because they're not going to be ready to move out of their current place. Typically, people aren't waiting till the last minute to find their new place. So we find that 60 days is that sweet spot where we have enough time to market and enough time for that tenant to give notice. Now, when we are talking about leases, there are some terms where there are laws that are going to dictate what you can put in those leases. So there's a law that came into effect a few years ago called SB 1414, and it came about because of a bunch of class action lawsuits. And this law actually defines what is a reasonable late fee and what makes a safe harbor for a reasonable late fee. So on your property in single family, 1 to 4 family, the late fee should not exceed 12% of the rent. Or in multifamily, that's 5+ units, it should not exceed 10% of the rent. You can only charge more if your actual damages exceed that amount. It's supposed to be an actual cost, and a lot of people were trying to use late fees as penalties. Now, we have a very high upfront late fee, and that is to help deter late payment. However, we put those high fees so that we can negotiate them down. But again, if you're trying to do a $300 or $400 late fee, that's not going to fly. That does not follow the law. So let's talk about the tenancy. Everything in North Texas and Texas in general is covered in Property Code chapters 92 and 24. So those are the chapters that cover residential tenancies. If you have a property in another state, you'll want to find out what property codes apply to your property in your state. Ignorance of the law does not limit your liability. So very important. You can't just do what you want to do, and if something happens or you get sued or a complaint is filed, you say, well, I didn't know. That doesn't fly. Security devices are one of the ones where we see people go the wrong the most. And it's a huge liability, because not only if you do it wrong, does it create liability because of safety access to the property. And if somebody breaks in and you didn't provide them the proper locking deadbolts, could you be liable for damages or emotional trauma, et cetera? But also very important because a tenant can vacate their lease. So I've listed out here the main things that we see people don't put on their property. And you'd be amazed. We take over properties from other property managers and they don't have these things in place. So smoke alarms in all bedrooms and in hallways outside of clustered or banked bedrooms. A peephole on all exterior doors, even the door into the garage. Yes. Now, if the door has a glass panel, you can see through. You don't have to do a peephole. A keyless deadbolt with a thumb turn on the interior on every door. So that means thumb turn on the inside, nothing on the outside. You also have to have a keyed lock with a key on the outside for the front door. No keys are allowed inside. That's a fire code risk. 2 points of locking on sliding doors. So that could be a pin lock in a bar. It could be a bolt lock in a bar. It could be a chain lock. There's a lot of options, but 2 points of locking on every sliding door. And then between every tenant, you must rekey the property and test smoke detectors and, of course, change batteries as needed. You also need to make sure you check the expiration date on the smoke detectors. We'll take over properties that have 20-year-old or 15-year-old smoke detectors. If your property was built in 2005, those smoke detectors are aged out. If your property is built in 2010, those smoke detectors are aged out and must be replaced. Now, technically the tenant's responsible for smoke detectors once they move into the property, but a step above and beyond that, we actually check them at walkthroughs. It's one of the many things that we look at, because sometimes you have to save people from themselves. They'll pull them down, they start beeping, they take the battery out. Although it's technically not your responsibility, it's a moral and ethical responsibility in my mind. So we do have our team take the extra time to test the smoke detectors while they are there. And if we find that there's a battery missing or dead, we will replace it and bill it back to the tenant. Now, for repairs and maintenance, there's a lot of things that you want to keep in mind. There is an emergency timeline in property code that is technically 48 hours, but it really is what constitutes an emergency. If it's 85 degrees out and the AC is out, that's not an emergency. Routine repairs, it's generally understood it's a week, but there's very specific requirements that a tenant has to follow to be able to make a demand if you're not meeting that timeline. So you want to, of course, do repairs as quickly as possible, but there's a lot of things that go into making repairs on a tenant occupied property. The tenant may not be available to have someone come in, or may not want to let them in for 2 weeks. They might be sick. So it's, again, one of these gray areas, but there is some timeline outlined in property code. Access issues are something that you definitely want to keep in mind. If a tenant really can't make access and can't be available, but they have no air, you might have to go let the tenant in or provide a key copy. So again, if you have a property manager, they're going to take care of this for you. But if you're self-managing, just because the tenant can't be available doesn't mean that the repair doesn't have to get done. You want to make sure that if it's a repair that the tenant is responsible for, that you bill that back to the tenants, but you have clear documentation on it. Probably the most common that we see is people putting baby wipes down plumbing lines, tampons down plumbing lines, kids putting little army figurines down plumbing lines. Those are going to be your most common. I do recommend you carry a home warranty to curb expense costs, especially in the beginning of ownership. And then, of course, if you're going to hire a property manager, one of the requirements should be that they have in-house maintenance or access to a handyman. That way they're not having to use GCs or licensed trades for every little thing because it's so expensive. Now let's talk about the move out process, because this is another area where it really comes together and you really help your bottom line. Because what I see is that a lot of people, their tenant moves out and they just consider everything normal wear and tear. Unless they've just completely destroyed the house, they consider it normal wear and tear. And that's just not the case. So one of the first things is what's considered abandoned. What do we consider moved out? And so when we look at abandonment versus surrender, a lot of people make the mistake here. So if you have a tenant that has not paid rent and you go to the property and you find it empty, you don't just take possession of the property. Unless the tenant has told you they are going to be out and you've given them a deadline to be out, you must post an abandonment notice. That is to protect you so that the tenant doesn't come back and say, oh no, I was still there, I just was buying new furniture. If surrender occurs, that is when keys have been turned in, the tenant has told you they're going to be out, they've surrendered in writing. So different ways to consider that property now vacant. Once a tenant moves out, you have 30 days to itemize their deposit. That means to provide an itemization of the charges and account for their deposit to them. Whether they lost it or whether you're returning it, you have 30 days or you can be liable for treble damages, 3 times the deposit amount wrongfully withheld. The 30-day timeline does not begin until they move out or until they provide the forwarding address. So if they give you a forwarding address a week after move out, the 30 days starts after that week. A lot of people will make the mistake of charging to repaint a house after a tenant has lived there 5 years just because it needs to be repainted or recarpeted. There are effective lives of things. Now, this is not outlined in the law, but there is case law and basically history of what is determined reasonable. And so if you have 10-year-old carpet, that tenant really shouldn't be responsible for 10-year-old carpet. Same thing with paint. If that paint is 10 years old, it's not going to look perfect when it's touched up. And it's not something that you're going to be able to build a tenant for. Now, if they've punched holes in the walls and those types of things, well, then of course you're going to build a tenant for that. But if you have a property that is primed and needing those updates to be done because of the age of it, that's really not something you should be billing the tenant. Now, there are some ways in the law that a tenant can vacate a lease early without penalty. Military relocation, and that is after a certain period of time they give notice. It gives you a little bit of time to mark the property. But there are ways that they can vacate immediately without notice and without having to have that marketing time. Examples of that would be family violence, stalking. If you have a spouse that beats up their spouse inside the home and they get arrested and there's a police report and a restraining order, that's an example. If there's a stalking situation, that can be an example. So you, of course, want to make sure you get the proper documentation and things, but very rare that those happen. We maybe run into 1 or 2 a year. It's pretty rare on a portfolio our size, but they can happen, so you need to be aware of the law. And the lease actually outlines those items for you as well. Now, for evictions, this is very, very different state to state. And so what I'm talking about here is North Texas. So first, we talked about the 1-day notice override instead of having to give a 3-day eviction notice. I do recommend you mail it and track it and make sure it's sent with that tracking where you can track it. If they don't get it, then I would recommend you send it again with a trackable method or go post it at the inside door of the property. The problem with posting is it's very subjective. I've seen that go wayside in court, and so I like to have a USPS tracking to prove that it was sent and received. So the first step is to send the demand to vacate. Now, a lot of different things about how we handle these eviction notices that people don't realize from the law. So it's important that when you give that notice to vacate in the first notice, you do not give them an opportunity to pay. It doesn't mean that you can't accept payment, but it needs to just say that we want possession of our property. We're going to file a justice of the peace court. You have 24 hours to vacate, etc. If you accept any payment after that date or after a court filing, it voids the entire process and you must start over. Once that timeline is up, you've done your notice to vacate, 24 hours has passed, now you can go file your forcible entry and detainer suit. That's your eviction. You have to make sure you determine the right jurisdiction. Ours are filed in justice of the peace courts, and that's done in front of a justice of the peace. You can e-file online or you can file in person. So you want to make sure you file for the court that services your property. After that is filed, they typically will hear the case within 14 to 21 days. And then at that hearing, once you win, the tenant will have 5 days to appeal. Very, very rare that a tenant will appeal. We have them maybe one a year. And then once the tenant has that 5-day period up, if the tenant has not vacated, you can file for a writ of possession. And that is where the constable will go out with you and set all their belongings to the curb. Very rare that it gets to that point as well. Most tenants leave before we even get to court. Now, this all comes back to the question, do you need a property manager? And there's a lot of ways that we look at the thresholds of whether or not you need a property manager. Specifically, if you're investing in a market that you live in, you very well may not. I always recommend having a property manager. I have my team manage my own personal portfolio, and that is because I want people who are experts and able to do it. And one of the things that I always tell people is, would you want to give up your, $70, $80, $100,000 a year job to do something you can pay someone $70 a month to do? And the truth of the matter is, no matter how few properties you have, it is a job, because it is a 24/7 job, and inevitably you're going to have something that goes wayside. It might not be a big deal, but it's going to be time consuming, and you're not always going to know how to navigate it. And one little step can be a really big problem. And so I'm a big fan of using property managers. That said, I am a property manager, right? So I see the benefits of that. I know many people who successfully self-manage, especially in a market that they live in. So are you available 24/7 for emergencies and repairs? If so, great. If you're constantly traveling, you're constantly out of town, you're in meetings where you have to turn your phone off, not a good fit. Do you have a team of vendors available to handle repairs and items needed? And I'm going to even add on to this and say an affordable team of vendors. Do you have knowledge in local, state, and national laws, including all the things that we've just talked about? And are you prepared and willing to stay on top of those and constantly research for new changes in the industry? Are you able to be mean to people? This is one where people struggle a lot. I have people that they become very close with their tenants. I had one landlord one time that used to take his tenants to go grocery shopping, and he would go hang out with them. And then when they didn't pay, didn't want to evict them. It can be very hard. If you're renting to family, it can be really hard. Are you comfortable showing strangers your property, including evenings and weekends by yourself? And this is an important one, because you do have to remember that people that are looking at these properties, you know nothing about them. You don't have a background check. You don't know anything about them. And are you effectively able to market a property, respond to inquiries all day, every day, in the evenings, go show up to show them anytime? But these are the big ticket ones, right? Are you familiar with writing a lease and real estate contracts and addendums? Do you know how to process applications and adhere to Fair Credit Reporting Act and fair housing guidelines? Do you have the time to visit the property frequently, the knowledge to be able to know conditional issues and how to handle them, the time to follow up on violations? And are you comfortable attending court if you need to evict a tenant? This is often where people who've been self-managing, this is where they find us. The idea of going to court and testifying in front of a JP terrifies them, and rightfully so. Even when we're training someone new, I've had the same guy in my evictions department for, I think, almost 4 years. But when we're training someone, it can be a very just scary thing to go think that you're going to talk in front of a judge and in front of a courtroom. So what is a property manager? They should be a licensed real estate broker or brokerage, licensed being key, and should really have a team under them. I find that the mom and pop teams, they can be wonderful, don't get me wrong, but the level of services and the number of services they can provide is going to be limited by the amount of their staffing. I was talking with an investor earlier this week on a consult, and he was firing his property manager because they just didn't have the staffing to even do quarterly visits. The little things you don't think about. Like, we have 3 people who all they do all day, every day, is walk through properties. A specialist in leasing, marketing, and managing rental properties. This is a big one. They need to actually specialize in what they're doing. Every time the market drops or the market has issues or there's no inventory, everybody becomes a property manager. You need someone who is truly a property manager. They need to be knowledgeable in Texas property code or your state's property code, fair housing, and HUD requirements. And in my opinion, the most important after being licensed is that they should be an investor themselves. How many properties do they own? Do they invest? Do they follow their own model? You would be amazed how many people out there teaching don't. I can think on my at least one hand of the number of quote gurus out there that rent property, like literally themselves rent property they don't even own. So a property manager is going to do some or all of the following: rent collection, repair oversight, evictions and collections, leasing and marketing, bookkeeping, accounting, and 1099s for your properties, application processing, routine property visits, and rental registrations and inspections. If your property manager is not handling all of these items, you need a new property manager. So the things that you want to verify when you're interviewing property managers, you want to make sure they're licensed and insured. This is really important because a lot of states don't require insurance. Texas is one of them. There's only specific times that a property management company is required to be insured. Make sure they are a realtor, not just a broker, and that they have MLS access. Now, again, this might change, but right now you have to have a realtor membership to be able to have access to the MLS to post properties. And you want to make sure they're actually using MLS. A lot of agents won't because they have to pay out a reciprocal commission and it costs them more. And so you want to make sure that they're doing proper marketing. Now, most property management has to be done under the broker. The broker must oversee all activities. And so a lot of agents will self-manage under the radar against their license. I see it every day. So you want to make sure you're asking those pointed questions. Make sure they specialize in property management. Again, very important. You want to make sure they're doing those routine visits. Make sure they're including the routine visits. And make sure they have people local to the areas they service. And again, make sure they own rental properties. They will never understand what it is to have cash flow and how to manage cash flow and mitigate expenses and mitigate risk if they themselves are not living the same experience. The bottom line is you probably don't want to be a property manager. Real estate is a business and you have to treat it like one if you want to succeed. It is a 24/7 commitment. However, it's important that if you're going to do it yourself, you get properly educated to do it. We're actually going to have a large property management mastermind class. I can't remember the exact date, but it'll be upcoming. We'll blast it out. I think it's in November. And it's going to go over everything to do with property management and how to manage a property. And that's something that you're going to be able to translate into other markets too. So if you're self-managing, if you just want to see if your other property managers are doing it the way it needs to be done. And this is a class that's not only going to be attended by customers and consumers, but also by other property managers learning how to just improve what they're doing. So that'll be about an hour and a half class that I will be doing, and it's going to go into all of this a lot more in depth. So again, I encourage you, please join our texting list so you can stay up to date on all of the classes and events that we have upcoming, and join our mailing list so that you can keep up to date on what we have, not only for our in-person events, but also our upcoming webinars and classes. The next class we're going to do is going to be over 1031 exchanges after the doubling process. So keep an eye out for that email coming out. And again, I am always here if you want to do a consultation to talk about what you're doing, what's working, what's not working, and how to get to that next level. That is what I do all day, every day. And I would love to help you on your journey to help you accomplish what it is your goals are. I thank you so much for attending today. It's been my pleasure, and I will see everybody soon for our final class in the 4-part series. And I'm hoping to see everybody December 8th weekend. It's going to be a great time. And again, the party on the 9th is no business. It's just hanging out, being with like-minded people, having a great time. And we do that in the comfort of our own home. Have a wonderful weekend, everybody, and I will talk to you soon.